We're a couple of minutes early, but I think we will go ahead and start this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Diversity Awareness Committee. My name is Sally Wren, and I chair that committee. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit of the other things we do besides these monthly programs. Every Friday between 12 and 1, some people come for 15 minutes, some come for the whole hour. There are about 14 of us still on the corner of 9th Avenue and Seneca with our Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate, Choose Love, Not War. And so anyone is invited to come join us if you wish. You know, it's a public sidewalk. We have a couple of people from another retirement community that wanted to join us, and I said, oh my goodness, it's a public sidewalk, you're welcome. So that's what we do on Fridays and have since George Floyd. And a bit of a wonderful thing was done about this event, and that was Mark Munden of our staff, who's a videographer, did a video a few years ago, and that will be shown next Friday on the 29th on HHTV. And so, again, it's the 29th, leap year. It's leap year. It's the 29th Thursday is the movie. No, thank you. It's Thursday night. So that's something else for you to enjoy. So, again, I welcome you on behalf of our committee, and it's my pleasure again to bring one of our members who brought us this beautiful program tonight with Josh and his wife, Lisa, that came in from North Bend, and so we're happy to have them. And Bernice Kastner brought us this wonderful program, and I will ask Bernice to come up and introduce her grandson-in-law, Josh.
Is it on?
Yes, get
Okay.
behind the podium so you're in the video.
Well, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this program and very privileged to be able to introduce my marvelous grandson-in-law. Um, uh, so let me give you a little information about his background. When he finished high school, which is just about the time that I met him for the first time, because he and Lisa were classmates or were in the same school. And he won on a scholarship to the Chicago Institute of Art. And so he is an artist. And when they returned after he graduated, he did one thing after another, and then finally they did set up their own business. They have a company called The Medium, and they work in, among other things, they run the website for Humanities Washington, from whom we have received many programs. And so Josh is a very talented artist, and he has done a few other things. I mean, one of the things that he's done that, in fact, this book has interrupted is that he has been volunteering at the center out in their area where there's a juvenile detention center, and he's been teaching some of those kids in detention some art skills, which they have enjoyed very much. But this has been interrupted by this current project. So I will actually, I don't think there's much more I can say other than the fact that he has done so many different things with his art. And he's brought a couple of his earlier books, which were written for children. But this is a culmination of many things. Okay, Josh, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Wow. First, I just have to say, I've been doing this for, you can hear me good? Oh, it's too loud? Can turn it down a little? They'll adjust it? Okay. Well, I was going to say, this book has been out for a few months, and I've had a lot of introductions. That's by far the best introduction I've ever had, hands down. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, thank you, Bernice, for inviting me here today. My family and I have been coming here for years, visiting Grandma Bernice, and it's awesome to be here to present this project to this community. So thanks for coming. So I'm here to talk about my new graphic novel, We Are Not Strangers. And this project started with a story it started in my Uncle Marco's West Seattle kitchen as he was making my family his famous fresh-caught fish and chips. And as my uncle cooked his dinner, he told me the story of his grandfather. So his papu, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant from Turkey who arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. And Marco went on to tell me about attending his papu's funeral. So it was a typical Sephardic Jewish event, close family and friends, relatives he hadn't seen in years, so many familiar faces, but there were some people he didn't recognize at all. A handful of Japanese American guests began to arrive, and nobody knew who they were or why they came. But what Marco found out is that his papu would help these families when they were forced out of the neighborhood and incarcerated during World War II. So his story only took a few minutes to tell me, but for the next few days, I just really couldn't stop thinking about it. How does a Jewish immigrant with family still overseas threatened by the Holocaust end up helping out his Japanese American neighbors here at home? I had a ton of questions, did they stay in touch after the war? Were there other similar stories like this? So I went back to interview my uncle, and to get some more information. This is a drawing of him. And together we started to do some research to see if we could find out more about the story. So we were talking to our families and people from the old neighborhood to see if we could dig up some more details about his papu's story and find out what happened. So I knew that Marco was named after his papu, Marco Calvo, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant. And his papu had spent the beginning of his life on the small fishing island of Marmara. But the region was becoming very unstable for Jews at the time. And so Marco and many other Sephardic Jews came to America in hopes of a better life. And many of them arrived right here in the Pacific Northwest. So I went into the Ellis Island immigration database and found his official immigration documents from when Marco Calvo immigrated to Seattle in 1920. And we knew that when he was young, he lived in the Central District and he worked at Pike Place Market, at the fishing markets there, which at the time were primarily Japanese and Jewish owned. And we also knew that Marco Calvo owned and ran the Ferry Dock Tavern at Pier 52 down by the waterfront. And we were talking to several people who remembered him. So we were digging up all these vague details here and there, but as the weeks went by, we just weren't getting all that far. Seattle had changed a lot, since the 40s, and the people who would have any information about the story had died a long time ago. But I kept asking around, and this name just kind of kept popping up in conversations I was having with people. I'd hear, have you talked to Professor Nahr? You got to go see Professor Devin Nahr at University of Washington. And so I looked him up. And so Devin is the professor of Sephardic Jewish Studies at University of Washington and author of several books on Sephardic Jewish history. So I reached out to Professor Nahr to see if he had any advice for starting up the project. And he agreed to meet up with me on campus. And that first meeting with him is when I realized that this project was much more than just some family folklore. So Professor Nahr started talking about the parallels between the Sephardic Jewish and Japanese communities here in Seattle. And I started to learn about the Seattle Central District, which was a place where immigrants and minorities who were blocked from living elsewhere could kind of have an opportunity to get to know each other as neighbors and friends. And when I started digging into this neighborhood, I started to learn about some other stories of people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war. And so, yeah, so at that first meeting, Devin, Professor Nar, gave me a ton of, encouragement and resources and information. He just gave me a ton of homework, to be honest with you. So when I first heard that story, I thought it was a simple story of a Jewish guy who helps out his neighbors. But as I started researching, it was clear that this was about the type of environment, that creates that relationship. And so I discovered these maps of the Seattle Central District, which kind of highlight just how unique of an area this was. So you can see Ashkenazic Jews, Sephardic Jews. So these maps are based on a house-to-house survey conducted in 1939. And you can see how there are these concentrated neighborhoods, like Sephardic Jews, Japanese. And so there was like these pockets where people lived, but they all just kind of overlapped each other. So people of different backgrounds and cultures living right up against each other in this community. And I should take a second to talk about Sephardic Jews. I don't know is there any Sephardic Jews here? Okay, so I can tell you about this then. So a lot of people don't know there are different Jewish cultures. So when most people think of Jewish culture, they think of matzo ball soup, speaking Yiddish. Those are Ashkenazic Jews. It's pretty much the main stereotype you see in any movie or pop culture. So these are Jewish people who originate from Central and Eastern Europe. But Sephardic Jews come from Spain, Portugal, and the Middle East. And so the fundamentals of Judaism are the same, but they have different customs and foods. So this was something I was really excited to represent in the story. So the main character of my story is based on my family history, Sephardic Jews from fishing islands in the Mediterranean. And when, that's the main character. And when he arrives here in America, the U.S. immigration authorities really don't know what to make of this newcomer. The Sephardic Jews arriving in the United States were unlike the other 2 million Jews who were arriving here from Eastern Europe at the time. And these people didn't speak Yiddish, and many of them did not look like the typical European Jews the officials were accustomed to seeing. Authorities referred to Sephardic Jews as peculiar people, and other officials called them Turks of the Hebrew race. And this is something that I was really surprised to learn. Many of these folks were coming from the Far East region, and that was considered part of the Orient at the time, so they were often referred to with like a derogatory term called Oriental Jews, and I'd never heard anything like that before starting this project. But so the Sephardic Jewish immigrants continued to arrive in America, and they settled in cities all over the country. And Seattle became home to the second largest community of Sephardic Jews in the United States at the time. So like economic opportunities, including the railway, Great Northern Railway, and the Klondike Gold Rush, drew many of these Jewish people to the Pacific Northwest. And as soon as, I think it was 20% of Seattle's total Jewish population was Sephardic Jews at the time. So these people, immigrated to Seattle and found opportunities in the fish markets at Pike Place Market. And, the market, which was established in 1907, was celebrated as the soul of Seattle by the Jewish community. The Jewish community called it like a secular synagogue. The fish markets were this great place for immigrants who knew how to fish to find work. And Pike Place Market was also a welcoming ground for the Japanese community. Japanese markets at Pike Place were thriving, and it's estimated that 4/5 of the fishermen and farmers at the market were Japanese Americans before the war. So I was learning about this strong connection between Sephardic Jewish and Japanese cultures, and so fishing became like the big theme to tie my characters together. But this wasn't the only thing that these cultures had in common. So they, as I mentioned before, they lived in this central district, which was, this unique, really diverse place. Had the nickname Little Jerusalem for the Jewish people there. And it was also the location of Nihon Machi, which was Japantown. and that was, the residential social cultural center for the Japanese community there. And so as I started to dive deeper into the history, I started to think about my own memories of the Central District. And so when I was a kid, we lived in the suburbs, but I used to tag along with my papu to the city to run errands all the time. And he loved to take me through the old neighborhoods and tell me old stories about growing up in the CD. We usually take a detour, grab some, some dim sum or cioppino at one of the fish markets. And wherever we went, he always seemed to kind of know the owners. He just kind of always knew, he just seemed to know everybody always, wherever we went. And as a kid, I never really understood why we had to drive all the way into the city just to go to the bank or pick up some salmon for Passover. But, looking back, I think he just really wanted to stay connected with the community there. He was from a family of Jewish immigrants, and most of his family overseas had been wiped out by the Holocaust. And the Central District was a place, full of people with similar backgrounds, and he felt really comfortable there. So when I started this project, my papa wasn't around anymore, but I decided to do what we used to do together, and I jumped in my car and I headed to the city to start exploring, and I started to do some drawing. So here's my first sketch of the original Sephardic Bikur Holim synagogue in the Central District. And as I came across these important landmarks and settings, I would snap some photos and start sketching. This is the location of the real Ferry Dock Tavern, which my uncle Marco Calvo ran and owned. And so this was the setting I used for a lot of my character scenes. If you kind of blur your eyes and don't see the Starbucks sign, it's not that different. And so the more I kind of immerse myself into these environments, I could really solidify the setting of the story and kind of put important landmarks in the backgrounds of my scenes. So this is Washington Hall, which was a historic public dance and music hall, which was a settling gathering place and settled in the house for a lot of immigrant cultures. So reference material was a huge part of my process, and that was the same when designing my characters and drawing them up. So I looked at a lot of old pictures, some from old family photos we had, and others I found from the time period, which I used to help create the characters in the story. And I started using some of the information I was learning about our family history in my artwork. And I used a lot of old newspaper headlines to kind of set the time frame of some of my scenes. I remember my papa would always be reading the paper, and when I was looking up information and trying to figure out timeline, I just kind of used that as, for one of my character's traits, to just always be reading the paper. So I used a lot of reference photos also that I found online to start compiling images to draw from and creating these scenes. But every once in a while, I'd have, I'd use a lot of photos for reference, and sometimes I'd, come across an idea for a character pose that I couldn't really picture in my head, and I couldn't find a reference for. So I have my family pose for me. And so I want to show you a couple of these photos of my family, who's constantly subjected to me rushing into their rooms and interrupting whatever they're doing, just forcing them to get into some strange pose. I take their pictures to draw from like this, but a lot of times I'll come right back in and make them, do it from a different angle. A lot of times I make them use props. You can see here's my wife, Lisa, in the back there. And she has no context for why she's doing this, but it's really nice to have live-in, models. That makes my job a lot easier. So in the same way that I rely on the reference material for my artwork, the same went for writing my scenes and storylines. So I really wanted to all the things that happened to my characters in the story to come from true stories or anecdotes I picked up along the way. And interviews and archives and stuff like that. So one of the most valuable places for source material that I found throughout the whole process was densho.org. So for those who don't know, Densho is kind of the Japanese incarceration archive based here in Seattle. And this is where I started to learn about what happened to the Japanese American community here in Seattle during the war. And I don't know how it was for most of you, but for me, I didn't learn much of this at all growing up. I learned a ton about the Holocaust in Hebrew school and in public school, but the incarceration camps were, barely a blip on my education that we brushed over in history. And, one thing I really didn't piece together until working on this project was that, these events were happening simultaneously. And so the main character in We Are Not Strangers is faced with this dilemma. As a Jew, he is relying on the United States as an ally against the Nazis. But at the same time, his Japanese American friends and neighbors are being forced into camps, right here in America. And so this is something I had never thought about before working on this project. And when I discovered the Densho archive, I started to learn a lot of things that I'd never heard before. So, and I'll just go through some of those things that I learned. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, 120,000 Japanese Americans were stripped of their rights and forced into camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. And most people lost everything, including property, businesses, and possessions. 2/3 of those imprisoned were born right here in America. They were native-born American citizens, and not one prisoner was ever found guilty of any crime. And when they were released, they came home to virtually nothing, so they had to start their lives over completely from scratch. But there were some, really rare stories of people who did reach out to help, and especially in these communities where people from different backgrounds got to know each other as friends. So there's stories of people who rented out their neighbors' houses for them and collected the rent money to pay the mortgage while they were away, like in Marco's family story, the story that I learned about. And then there's also stories of people helping by keeping businesses afloat, storing possessions for them while they were gone, caretaking properties, so that when they were finally released, from the camps, their neighbors had at least something, to come home to. So the more stories I learned about this, that were like this, I could kind of weave them together into this, historical fiction narrative. So I was spending a lot of time on Densho, researching these stories and watching video oral history archives, pulling source material, and eventually I decided to just reach out to them for help. And the historians and staff there at Densho were absolutely amazing. They gave me feedback and pointed me in different directions for resources and stuff like that to help tell my story in more detail. So Densho was founded by Tom Akeda, who wanted to document and share World War II Japanese American incarceration history, and he conducted over 250 video oral history interviews. And then there's one interview that I wanted to share with you guys, and it's the story of Aki Kurose. So for people who are from Seattle, you might recognize her name. She was a well-known educator and peace activist, and Seattle Public Schools honored her by naming a middle school after her. And in 1941, she was a 10th grader at Garfield High School in Seattle, and that's when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And in this video, she kind of recalls this in great detail. And after the initial shock and chaos, that followed, she remembers, going back to school for the first day back, and she remembers one of her favorite teachers comes up to her, walks up to her, and confronts her and says, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." And she talks about, how threatened she felt, how up until that point she thought of herself as a normal, American girl. Just she was popular, had tons of friends in the community, and then all of a sudden she was the enemy. And this was one of the themes I really wanted to kind of address in my story. I kept asking myself, how is it even possible that people's friends and neighbors can just so quickly change like that into being the enemy? And from what I was learning, this stuff doesn't just happen out of the blue. The media can have this habit of promoting, a climate of fear and misinformation, as we see all the time. And these, I took a lot of these from old propaganda posters. These are like the most tame ones I could find, honestly. So yeah, during these times of conflict, the narrative of dehumanizing groups of people and making them seem, dangerous can spread, really fast. And then, the messages are so powerful that it makes it hard for people to go against that. And that's, one of the things they talk about at Densho, is the idea of bystanders and upstanders. So the character in We're Not Strangers, the main character is an upstander, right? He goes against what he's being told. He reaches out to his friend, find out how he can help, and work with him to create a plan. And this, takes a lot of courage. Most people, myself included, can tend to be bystanders. Something might not feel right, and might see that people are not being treated fairly, but most people try to just sit back, wait, hold on, just see how things play out before they take action. And so that's something I really wanted to highlight, in the story, is just kind of the power of reaching out to people in our communities that are being treated unfairly and see what we can do to help. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the power of working with organizations. So, as you can probably tell, I learned a ton of during the process of creating this book. And, as an artist, I'm usually just heads down in my art studio, just working on my own. But when I reached out to these organizations, it added so much to my story, not only to get my facts straight, but, a really just a great collaboration. So Devin Narr actually ended up writing the afterword of We Are Not Strangers, and it's a really fascinating piece of work, kind of that dives deeper into the parallels between the Sephardic and Japanese cultures. So it was a really cool connection. And I continue to kind of, work together with Densho to, for events and stay educated and stuff like that. I also worked with For Culture, which is the arts and culture organization here in the state. They have grant and funding workshops. What's that? King County, sorry, you're right. And I had never applied for a grant before, but it was an awesome experience. They gave me a lot of encouragement and helped me create a plan. So that was really neat. I also hooked up with the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, which is similar to Densho in that they have, archives and a lot of history resources and events and stuff like that. They were a great resource. So if you want to learn more about Jewish history in the state, you should definitely check them out. There was a ton of other organizations that helped me out with this research. This slide always kind of makes me laugh because it looks like I'm a professional researcher or something like that, but this was all just kind of by accident because every person I talked to would just kind of point me into another direction for resources, and it just kind of grew from there. So I also relied on conversations and feedback from local authors. These are some really great books. Ken Mochizuki, who wrote Baseball Saved Us, wrote the foreword for We Are Not Strangers, which was a really neat connection. And then another thing that was neat is that, all the information I was learning about along the way can actually be found in the back matter of the book. I kept track of all the things I was learning along the way, and my publisher, when they were interested in kind of including that information, I was really excited because I think it's a great resource for anybody who wants to just kind of dive deeper into the history and into the facts. And for teachers, there's also an accompanying education guide, which was created by teachers who worked with my publisher. And it's great for educators who want to use the book in their curriculum. So along with all the help from professional writers and all these organizations, I wanted to just kind of point out a couple of the face-to-face conversations I have with people that added a lot to my project. So a lot of times in interviews, I would hear people mention, an important landmark, like I talked about before, that I could include in the background of my artwork. But sometimes my conversations with people, would turn into like a whole new chapter. And so one example of that is I knew the Sephardic Bikur Holim synagogue was, an important landmark that I wanted to have a scene there. And but I didn't know, what temple was like back in the 40s. But as I was asking around, one of her best friends from high school, had early childhood memories of going to synagogue there. And she told us about the women's section in the balcony where people would gossip and shush each other during the service while the rabbi was trying to speak. So I used that as the foundation of one of the chapters. Another example of a conversation that led to a whole new chapter. We have another family friend, Linda Suyama, who owns the Azuma Gallery. If you have a chance to check it out, it's an incredible gallery, Japanese fine art gallery. And I went to visit the gallery and to talk to Linda about my project, and she brought out these Japanese woodblock prints. And the prints actually became the focal point of this scene of a father teaching his daughter about their family origins. And so the prints kind of ended up being a unique way for my characters to, discuss their family history. So there's one more example I wanted to talk about. So I kept hearing about, you've heard, links? Okay. People, that's every time I would talk to people, they're like, you've got to include Links Tackle Shop in your book. And so I knew I was going to have a scene there. So Links Tackle Shop was a Japanese American owned shop in the Central District. And yeah, needed to have a scene there. So I got in touch with the owners, Jerry and Maria Beppu, who, were nice enough to invite me into their home for an interview. And when I told them that my story was about, highlighting people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war, when they heard that, they both just kind of looked at each other and smiled. And so Jerry went on to tell me the story of his dad, who was an immigrant from Japan who struggled to make a living in Seattle. But before the war, the tackle shop was, really starting to take off. And it was getting popular, and, the family was feeling stable. But one day he took the family up for a day of skiing up a Snoqualmie Pass. And when they drove back into Seattle, that's when they found out Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And it wasn't long after that they were forced to close the shop, evacuate to Puyallup Fairgrounds Assembly Center, where they would be held for months before being put into permanent camps. And so after years of living in the camps, the family returned home. And to their surprise, a Jewish insurance agent friend of theirs had continued to pay their insurance premiums while they were gone. And when the policy matured, the family received a payout, and they were able to reopen the shop. And the insurance agent even checked up on the shop while they were gone and stored supplies for them. So there's a lot more to the story. It was just such a cool moment because I went there to just interview these folks about just some details about the scene, and it turned out to be another example. It's just surprising. It was a really cool moment. And then I actually recorded the interview with them, which was neat because I could put that on the Densho archive. So it was kind of cool. So yeah, just another example of another story like this I could weave into my narrative. So this book has been out for a few months, and I keep getting asked, why are these stories so relevant today? And, there's still a lot of ignorance and violence that we unfortunately see in the news all the time. And, it affects these communities right here in our own neighborhoods. And sometimes it feels like the cycle of violence is just never going to end, I know I'm not the only one who has felt pretty hopeless this last few months. But, these true stories of real people from different backgrounds working together and helping each other during uncertain times, I think we can all agree that's something we need a heck of a lot more of these days. Sometimes it feels like we're almost encouraged to look at each other as strangers, and I really hope that the stories that I've highlighted in this book, act as a reminder that it just doesn't have to be that way. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions. Were you going to go with the microphone for questions, or just people can? Oh, you have a process?
Over here, I have a question.
I would like to know the length of time you spent with the research and everything to do this book. Was it years, months?
It was longer than I thought, because I got that question when I first came out, and wasn't quite sure, and so I dug up a text message that I had sent to my uncle after, like the day after I heard that story the first time, and it was 4 years ago, 4 years to the almost date of when it was published. So it was about a 4-year process. And yeah, when I first started it, I didn't really know what it was going to be. I thought it was going to be maybe a small little comic or something small I could publish locally. And then, as you can tell, it just kind of grew organically and turned into something larger over the years. So.
I think it's on.
You have an interesting name, Tuininga. What is the origin, historically, of the name?
That has been confused. Some people even thought it was Japanese. No, it's Dutch. It's from my dad's side. Yeah, my dad. So my dad married the Sephardic girl who was my mom. Yeah, he's from Colorado.
This is not a question, this is a comment. A very good friend of mine, who's Japanese, said the tables were turned when China became very aggressive in the United States, and a lot of Japanese people started wearing buttons that said, "I'm not Chinese." So our attack on people who don't look like us or share the same culture just seems to go on and on.
It does, and I mean, it's interesting you brought that up, because that's the same with Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews too. My grandpa, my papu was Sephardic, and he married an Ashkenazic Jew, and that was like, you don't do that back then. Yeah. So they kind of paved the way for that. But yeah, even in that culture, it was still like there's separation, you know. Mm-hmm. But
are you having any pushback, so to speak, from the religious right, from the political right, about the fact that you're bringing out something that is negative, basically, that is American history? Are there any phone calls, any picket lines in front of your house?
Oh my gosh, no. I was a little nervous when this started. The attack in Israel, happened only a few weeks after this book came out, and when I did my first event, I was a little nervous, but mainly I've had the opposite. I've had people who disagree and have really interesting conversations, because if why I'm talking about the story is about people from different backgrounds that come together, and so you can't really argue with that, in this setting. So that's been good, and yeah, I don't know. That's been my experience so far. So we'll see. I mean, I've been mostly in Washington State and the West Coast. So if I tour around somewhere else, it might be different. But I kind of welcome that. So.
Hello.
I might. I don't know. I've been to Miami. That's about it. So we'll see.
Yeah, you mentioned several examples of Sephardic, Jews helping Japanese, during their internment and then returning property to them. And after, in general, could you make a comment about how common that was, even among other groups as well?
In my extremely rare. Yeah. Although, I mean, from my perspective, it almost doesn't seem rare, because the stories just kind of come out of the woodwork, especially after this book has been published. There's been stories that people come up to me and tell me something similar. So it has brought more out. So I almost feel like I have an altered sense of how common it was. But when I talk to historians, and especially when I talk to Densho, and I think it was really important to show how rare it was. It wasn't something that happened very often. Yeah. Oh, has anyone banned my book? No, I don't. I don't think. I don't think. I think it's just been out too soon for that to happen. But I no, that hasn't even been on my radar.
I had two friends who were Japanese, and they were both gardeners. Is there an idea where the Japanese who came to America went to work and fit themselves in?
Uh,
I have two friends from the Bay Area in California who were Japanese, and they went to work as gardeners and did a beautiful job. Do we know what professions or occupations Japanese people went to when they came to America?
well, I'm sure it's plenty. The one most that I focused on was the connection. You know, the fishing connection, and Pike Place Market. You know, that was just like the spot. You know, for farmers and fishermen and just stuff like that, and canning, stuff like that. So yeah, flower shops, stuff like that. So.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. Okay, I just had a comment to make because many of us here have enjoyed our visits to Kubota Garden in southeast Seattle. And there's a story about how that garden happened to survive the war. And I published the newsletter for the Kubota Garden Foundation. And one day I got a letter, and it told a story, a parallel story, this time out of another industry. And in this case, Mr. Kubota had been the gardener, which was another big occupation for Japanese people here in the Seattle area. And he had contact, well, one of his big clients was a wealthy lawyer in the center city. And when he heard what was happening, the lawyer made a visit to the Kubota's place, which of course was in almost to the city limits. And he agreed to get a renter in their house, to manage the money, to keep an overview. And it was all done very quietly between this attorney and Mr. Kubota. Wow. And when they returned, everything was overgrown. It was a mess, but it was there, and they had the truck in the garage.
Wow.
This was all done just between two individuals who respected each other. But there's a better story. The son who was writing this said that he came home from school one day and his father was really upset because he had received a visit from the FBI. And the FBI wanted to know what he knew about the Kubota family in great detail.
Wow.
This was not appreciated by the attorney, but they went away, and the Kubotas came back, and years later, the city acquired the garden, and soon, in April and May, it's going to be gorgeous, and you all should go there.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's an amazing story. That's amazing. I'm every time I do one of these events, and I've done quite a few, there's this another story. I'm like, that is its own graphic novel that somebody needs to write and draw. It's just like, it's just incredible, right? It's just, yeah. I'll have to hook up with you later because I want to hear more about that story, and just if there's a published thing, I want to see it.
I'll look it up in the newsletter.
Okay. Oh, okay.
I have a question. So I'm curious, where did you go to high school?
I went to Newport High School in Bellevue.
Yeah, and they didn't say anything about the relocation of the Japanese?
I mean, like I said, I knew of it.
okay,
that's
so
about
it
it.
kind of whizzed by.
It was exactly like that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and we were lucky that we at least knew. And in our high school, we had a ton of Japanese people there, Japanese Americans, and it was it was a pretty diverse school. But if you go not that far east, no one knows anything about
There were
this,
strawberry fields where Bell Square is now. That
Yeah,
they were run
I've heard
by
that story.
Japanese, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the people who were helping, were they in any kind of danger, let's say from the insurance company, from the government, whatever, FBI or whoever? In other words, did they in any way endanger their being, their family, their existence, their jobs, because they helped the Japanese?
Yeah, I don't know that much about it, but there is it's kind of a spoiler for the story, but the main character in this story, there was a lot of immigrants who came here illegally, right? And so in this story, the main character's mother has arrived illegally, and so he's helping out this. He doesn't really want to draw attention, to the family, but he still does. And there were stories of that I learned of. So that's an example of taking a risk, a pretty big one, No, on the Jewish side. So, it's somebody who had an illegal immigrant living in their house, but they're helping out this person. That's pretty risky, So that's an example. Yeah, exactly. And that's that's another example that I put in the book. There was he's reading a newspaper article about, Jewish immigrants who are not allowed to arrive here. So. She has a question back there.
Way over there, Nancy.
I really enjoyed your sketches. Could you describe your art? The story is probably the story, but how did the art happen too? They're just wonderful sketches.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I've been drawing my whole life. People, that's one of the questions I get a lot is from friends. They're like, you drew all these pictures? How'd you do it? And for me, that is kind of been the easy part. The research and the planning and everything, that was and once I finally had a story and I have a script and my storyboard, it's like the drawing, that's why I do this. That's how I started. So that was just kind of fun. And I could finally start drawing and do what I love too. Yeah, I draw with pencil and then, and I do a lot of work on my iPad for inking. Yeah, that's the process. Yeah. Oh, she has a question.
And what do you have in mind for the future? Do you have that next book vision going, or?
I definitely want to do another story, but as you asked before, it takes a long time to do these things, so I want to make sure whatever I'm doing is something I really want to commit and immerse myself in for years, so I have a few things in the works, and we'll see what happens, but I'm definitely going to do something else.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Shall I go ahead? Yeah. So I think it's really interesting. Is it on? Is it working? I think it's really interesting that you went to school in Bellevue, because of whoever asked the question, Anna. Now we know that there was a massive displacement from Bellevue of all the strawberry farmers. But you were there when, in the 60s or something? How old are you? I don't know, 70s, 80s? Well, anyway, it's taken
90s.
90s, okay. Well, 3 generations. The first generation, totally silent. Second generation, told to behave themselves and not make a spectacle ever. It's the third generation now who is coming out with the stories, artists and other people. So it's very interesting, 90s.
Well,
that's not quite that was a little soon for these stories to be acknowledged.
Well, yeah, they weren't acknowledged then.
That, right.
Yeah.
So that's
And-
actually almost 50 years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and the that's another similarity that if you read the book you'll see is the parallel between the Sephardic Jew or the Jewish community and the Japanese community. You know, most of the people I interviewed, they had no idea even what happened to their own families, you know, and that's definitely the case when talking to, you know, people in our family who lived through the Holocaust. They didn't want to talk about it. You just work hard, you move forward, and you just keep silent about it to protect your kids or who knows why. And that's the same definitely went for the Japanese American side that I was learning. And so, but I think it's good that these stories are coming out, right? Because we can obviously have a lot to learn from them.
Josh, thank you so much for the history lesson and your art, and most of all for you. So it's been a privilege having
Thank you all
here tonight.
Thank you
Let's
all
give
so
him
much.
another hand.
Appreciate it. Thank you.